find time to recuperate and recharge. But of course, we do know there is still a lot going on in terms of things that we'll be seeing on social media, on the news in terms of Palestine. So that is one thing I didn't really want to kind of put to the side. So we're going to continue with the show today, focusing on Palestine. And we had mentioned, actually, I think it was just the show before the holidays where we were marking Read Palestine Week. And during that show, I was joined by Shmaiza Rashid and Samia Aziz, and we were talking about different books by Palestinian authors. It was a cookbook, but we did also mention The 100 Years War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. So today we're going to be discussing that, and I'm really delighted to have Samia Aziz with me on the show. So Samia is a book blogger and also the founder of the Diverse Bookshelf podcast. So it's a fantastic podcast. I really recommend that you have a look at it, listen to all the different interviews that Samia has done. Absolutely amazing. And also even recent shows have been there has been a focus on Palestinian writers and Palestinian stories as well, so definitely do check that out. So just to start off with, for those of you who might not have heard the show before at the Christmas break, I'm going to read the blog, and then I'm going to, we're just going to delve straight into the conversation around the book. So the blurb at the back says, drawing on his family's experiences and archives and those of other Palestinians, Rashid Khalidi reclaims the fundamental right of any people to narrate their history on their own terms. So this is also now a book that actually we read last month in December for Dar Amana Book Club, which is a book club that we run basically in Luton for women. So again, if you're ever interested in joining us, we meet once a month. Just get in touch with the studio and we can give out details to any kind of female bookworms that would like to join us. So we're happy to welcome you. And actually on that point, this month we are reading Yellowface by Rebecca Kuang, I think is the way to pronounce it. So another fantastic book. So if you are kind of interested in joining a book club, maybe you've made a New Year's resolution to read more, because obviously that's always a good way to start the year. So joining a book club will definitely help with that. Right, so I'm going to welcome my guest, Samia. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well. It's very chilly here in Luton today. But no, I'm doing well, alhamdulillah. And how are you?
Yeah, alhamdulillah, I'm well. I think same as you. I did kind of struggle a little bit to get out of the bed, and then struggled to get out the door. And then I was obviously saying to you this morning, I kind of didn't bring my gloves, and I wish I had. So still, it hasn't snowed yet. Actually, my daughters were saying that it hasn't snowed. Do you think it might snow?
There was like a few snowflakes yesterday.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Yeah, there were a few, and I think it snowed in London.
That's true. That's true.
So maybe we'll get some.
Maybe we will. Yeah, maybe we will, because I know children love that. And actually, there was a teacher I follow on Twitter, X, whatever we call it nowadays, and it was funny because he just mentioned that it snowed, obviously some snowflakes, and he was like, oh, but we're not going to be shutting the school down, because obviously that's usually the first thing kids usually want to happen. But anyway, so right, yes. So today's book on the book club show is The 100 Years War on Palestine, by Rashid Khalidi. The kind of subtitle says A History of Settler Colonial Conquest and Resistance. So do you want to just kind of give us your initial thoughts on the book? And I know you've obviously also on your podcast, the Diverse Bookshelf podcast, which is correct, right? I always get worried I've missed something out.
No, that's right.
Okay,
the Diverse Bookshelf.
Cool. So in terms of that, I know you obviously had the pleasure even interviewing Rashid Khalidi, who's the author of this book. So could you want to tell us a little bit about that, and your general kind of initial thoughts on the book itself?
Yeah, I mean, so Rashid Khalidi, he is a historian by profession. He comes from like a line of academics and historians and like political activists and people that have been involved in real sort of like historical landmarks in the Middle East. Peace negotiations and all of those kind of things. And so he's written, in terms of like his books and journals, over 100 published pieces, which is wild to think that somebody has done that much. And so I think it's important to remember, like, going into this book, that it is written by a historian and academic. But my understanding is that it's the first book that he's written that is trying to be a little bit more accessible. He talks about his family and people that he's known and people that he's met, to try and make it a little bit more like accessible, try and make it a little bit more, I don't know, like relatable, I guess. And I think like it's such an education, the book, because it spans over 100 years, because the book opens in like in like 1800s, in the 19th century, so it spans a long time. And I think it just helps us understand what's happened historically. But it's a lot of information crammed into it's not like, the book I think is about 50 pages of it is just notes and the bibliography, right? So it's not actually that long. It's a lot of information crammed in, but is really, really informative in terms of what's happened, what's been happening, in terms of like the Zionist project, but also changes within Palestine. So I think it's an excellent resource. Like, I think it's a really, especially because, we're led to believe that it's so complicated and it's been going on for so long and we don't really know what's been happening. But, like Rashid Khalidi, like, he kind of breaks it down a little bit and he's like, it's not that complicated. And, there's evidence and there's like sources that show us what's happened. And so I think that it's a really good tool to use to just educate yourself. Because I think we live in an age of like false news and fake news, but also like the pro-Israeli and pro-Zionist narrative is so loud, and they're sort of, some of what they say about Palestinians or about Hamas comes across fairly convincing sometimes, right? And so it's important to be able to empower yourselves and educate ourselves, just so that we can say, you know what, that line of argument, that's not true, or that thing, that's false, that never happened. Just to be able to know sort of what is the truth. I think it's a really good, like a good book to help.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I agree what you're saying about the book in itself being an education, and actually that's one of the most wonderful things, I guess, when it comes to reading, because like you said, there is so much disinformation when it comes to the things, I guess, we see visually on TV or on the news. And obviously, just for our listeners, disclaimer that these are the views that we're kind of sharing in terms of the book, and the views are obviously of our guests that we have on the show. So the 100 Years War on Palestine, as we mentioned, it literally actually kind of spans a very, very kind of extensive timeline. The chapter itself, the first one, yes, it starts off literally in kind of, well, I mean, this starts with the 1990s, but there's a chapter which is looking at, I'm just trying to find it, for example, the fifth declaration of, no, sorry, the first declaration of war, which is 1917 to 1939, which is literally the first chapter. So I guess my question is, what do you think, like if we look at even British history, right, we've gone to school, we don't really learn about empire and, and colonialism and all of these things that actually is part and parcel of our history as Britain. So how can we kind of change the bigger kind of approach to education, right? Because obviously people might still think, as obviously, we will see discussions that things in Palestine, almost the starting point was 7th of October. But, how can we change that? Because obviously there is always a history, to look at. So obviously, reading is, I guess, is one way. But I guess what I'm trying to ask is, systemically, how do we kind of approach that, do you think?
I mean, I don't know if I have the answer to that question.
No, of course.
But I think
you on the spot.
I think like educating ourselves on like an individual level is the place to start. Is that if we know what historically is true, if we understand the role of the British Empire historically around the world, I think what will change is like the attitude and the understanding of the general public, because if lots of people are doing it and then conversations are happening and people are telling their children and telling their families and their friends, I think there becomes like a wider sort of knowledge and acceptance of what's happening, and that I think has the potential of becoming pressure which can help in changing like school curriculums. It can help in putting pressure on media outlets, big media outlets, because actually, like, you know, the BBC and like the New York Times and the Guardian, and these places play a pivotal role in the education of the public. They play a pivotal role in like how like certain wars and certain political situations, even in terms of like the UK general election, right? Like they play such a big role in informing and educating and sort of like inspiring or like, you know, kind of guiding the general public. But I think it works both ways. I think the general public can influence, but it's something that I think is going to take time. I think it's going to take like sustained effort, which is not what we're particularly great at, especially in this time, because we live in an age of instant gratification. Like, I know I feel frustrated if I go onto Netflix and I see a show is releasing a weekly episode. Right. I'm just like, why? Just give it to me all at once. Like, why? It's so frustrating. Yeah. But like, you know, before Netflix, like, you know, you'd have to wait a week for a certain show on TV, right? You'd have to sit through adverts and you'd have to do all of that. But we just don't really have that patience, I don't think, anymore. But maybe relearning some of that, I think, is probably a way to start. But the other thing we can do is we can, like, also, some libraries are not very well stocked on these kind of books. So we can write to our libraries or contact them and ask them to put these titles in. We can suggest that they invite certain people or that they commemorate certain days in the year. That might help raise awareness, I think, at a maybe slightly larger level.
Yeah, definitely. It's such an important point, actually, when it comes to libraries. And I think we tend to forget that because, again, and it all comes down to this idea of consumerism, isn't it? Because we're constantly maybe going onto certain kind of online shopping websites to buy books. And, you know, but there's libraries are there, and you know, and actually, you know, sometimes I know people maybe don't realize, but authors still get kind of I don't know if royalty is the right term, but you know, they still earn money from their book, you know, so you're still able to support authors by you know, borrowing from the library as well. So in terms of the 100 Years War on Palestine, I mean, you know, one of the first things that really always hits me with, you know, in any book I read is who the author decides to kind of dedicate, you know, the book to. And even here, for example, he says he's dedicated it to his grandchildren, and he says who will hopefully see the end of this 100 Years War. And you know, it's something that really hits deep, because you realize actually that it's something that's been going on for so long, and you know, obviously, like we've discussed, if we're kind of ignorant of that history, you know, we've got this form of erasure, don't we? Which is partly some of the discussion that we had even in the previous show, where we were talking about the importance of culture and cooking, and you know, all these different things which are slowly being erased, and actually how do we keep those, so you know, history, for example, you know, isn't lost. Now, you know, one of the first things that is discussed in, you know, Rashid Khalidi, he mentions it in the book as well, is the idea of obviously the Nakba, which is like the catastrophe. So again, can you maybe just give, if any listeners who might not be aware of what that is, and I guess what impact that's still having even in today's discourse, I think would be really helpful.
You know, just before, you know, on the dedication, I just, because that's what you see as soon as you open the book, I found it so devastating, especially in terms of like what we're seeing right now, in terms of like the footage coming out, knowing how many children and babies have been killed in this war. Like, it feels so devastating to think of an entire generation who have never known peace, like never known stability. And I just remember like feeling like as if like someone had like stabbed my gut. Like it just felt so, it feels so just like devastating. Like there's almost like no words. And I just thought it was so, I just thought it was very, I don't know, like poignant that he decided to dedicate the book to his grandchildren, who, you know, I think are in the US mainly, and have grown up in peace. But obviously, like, I mean, Rashid Khalidi himself has not, and his parents and grandparents also did not. But and just also how we think about the fact that, like, trauma, it gets passed down, and how his grandchildren, although have probably grown up, and I think they're in the States, are still living, I guess, to some degree, the pain and the trauma because of what is passed down through generations. But on 1948 and the Nakba, so the Nakba kind of is the Arabic word, as you said, translates to be catastrophe, and it was, like, historically almost like the biggest loss of life at the time of the establishment of the state of Israel, kind of like politically and geographically. And we know actually that historically the British Empire, whenever it leaves a country, it leaves with bloodshed and partition, which is exactly what happened in 1948. So in 1917, I think it was 1917, that was when Britain decided to colonize Palestine, and that's when we had the signing of the Balfour Declaration. And they decided at that point that they would allow Jewish people to come and move into Palestine. Fine, no problem, you know. I mean, kind of weird that Britain were like, okay, we're just going to come and take over this land. But, you know, okay, that's what happened. That's what happened. But then in 1948, they decided to leave. And I'm assuming because of the sort of the mass migration of Jewish people into Israel following the Holocaust and the end of the Second World War. And they tend to leave when things get tricky, right? Like, this is what they do historically. So they set the borders of the state of Israel, and the Jewish population at the time was a minority, and yet were given pretty much the majority of the land, which is still a lot more than what Palestine has today. And what it meant was that it meant mass displacement, and it ended up being very violent and very bloody, and like thousands of people were killed, thousands of people were made homeless, and that's when I think we saw the first sort of like refugee camps and settlements set up. Now, you know, a lot of historical narrative will kind of say that the Nakba just happened in 1948. But I think there is a growing awareness and a growing sense that actually we should think about the Nakba as like a framework of what's been happening in Palestine ever since. It's not just a one-time event, because it didn't stop, really. Like, there have been periods of relative calm, and when we say calm, we just mean that, like, Palestine hasn't been relentlessly bombed, right? Like, that's what we mean when we say peace in that part of the world. But there has been so much occupation, there has been so much violence, continuing of forcing people out of their homes in Gaza, but also in the West Bank too. And this sort of catastrophe has always continued, and it just looks slightly different maybe over time. And I think that is important for us to think about it in those terms. I don't think what we're witnessing now is a second Nakba. I think it's a continuation of like what started in 1948.
No, absolutely. And I think that's the thing, this idea that things are still ongoing. And, you know, you mentioned, for example, you know, British rule and, you know, even partition. So if we look at, you know, India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, I mean, in some regards, we are still feeling, you know, the consequence of what, you know, the empire did and what Britain did. So for sure, I think you know, you're completely right. And I think what was really interesting is I remember reading The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Ilian Pape, and he mentions quite interestingly about this idea of language and the fact that you know, I think if I understood correctly, he was almost implying that because it was called the Nakba, but there was no kind of definition of who I guess like historically had called it, or what was it in reference to, that maybe that is something that means people are able to overlook it. What people who want to overlook it are able to just kind of even not think about actually what is the Nakba. Yes, it's a catastrophe, but who caused it and who suffered from it, so definitely I think that, again, there's a form of I mean, I guess willful ignorance on some people's part, but also this idea of just being able to look away and having the privilege, I think, to look away as well. And now we've got, for example, just a couple of minutes now before we go to the break, but what's heavily weighing even on my mind at the moment is we've been seeing all that's coming out on social media and the journalists that are based obviously in Palestine, in Gaza specifically at the moment, and we know of a particular journalist who is just recently lost another member of his family who was obviously killed, who was also a journalist, and it's just it's absolutely heartbreaking. But again, this idea of where is that international kind of solidarity, right? And we know, again, even I think it is actually tomorrow that Israel is being taken to the International Court of Justice, in terms of really looking at, the war crimes and potential, kind of genocide as well. So, all these things are really important, that we are kind of educating ourselves, that we are reading the books that we should read. And that's not to say that you don't want to know about what other people's views are, because obviously there will always be different views on something. But I think we just need to be, like Samia said earlier on, just be empowered that we do know, what's going on. And definitely a book like The 100 Years War on Palestine, I think really just definitely gives the context. So we are heading to the break. You are listening to me and Samia Aziz on the Book Club show, and we are going to continue this conversation. We'll use some of the quotes from the book to delve deeper. In the meantime, you can grab yourselves tea, coffee, and we'll be back shortly. Assalamu alaikum.
This program will continue after the break. Continue listening to Inspire FM. Inspire FM.
Inspire 105.1 FM.
Luton Food Bank energy saving tips. Turn down your boiler's flow setting. This controls the temperature water is when it leaves your boiler. Its default setting is usually too high. Turn it down a bit and your home will feel just as warm. Set your boiler's flow temperature between 55 and 60 degrees and you could cut your energy bills by 12% and save up to £112 in a year.
Enjoy quality and tasty 100% authentic halal Chinese and Thai food from Gao Express, brought to you by the team behind Top's Pizza in Luton. Choose from all your delicious Chinese and Thai favourites. Then order for delivery or collection from Gao Express in Wellington Street, Luton, Marketplace, Stevenage, and now also on Nightingale Road in Hitchin. Open daily midday till late. Find the number or order online at Gao, that's GAO, express.co.uk, or like Gao Express on Facebook.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم من يحرم الرفق يحرم الخير, that whoever is deprived of gentleness is deprived of good.
Do you have a legal problem? Are you trying to settle a family member? If so, then contact M&K Solicitors. M&K Solicitors are a leading local firm specializing in immigration, family, personal injury, clinical negligence, civil and property law. Our solicitors have over 20 years' experience and are recognized internationally. Our success rate speaks for itself. Take advantage of our free consultations for your first meeting. We also give free advice on Fridays, no appointment needed. That's right, free legal advice. M&K Solicitors. Call 01582 732 503.
The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, if a person mentions the name of Allah upon entering his house or eating, Shaitan says to his followers, you will have found nowhere to spend the night and no dinner. But if he enters without mentioning the name of Allah, Shaitan says to his followers, you have found a place to spend the night in. And if he does not mention the name of Allah at the time of eating, Shaitan says, you have found a place to spend the night in as well as food.
Did you know that over 361,000 children die every year due to lack of clean water? Clean water is not a luxury, but a basic human right. UKIM is working to end their suffering by providing clean and safe water. Make a difference. Provide clean and safe water with UKIM. For donations, call now or visit ukim.org.
Assalamu alaikum, this is Mariam.
This is Anisa.
And this is Sonia. And we are Sisters Speak.
Sisters Speak is a weekly discussion program where us girls discuss a variety of topics.
Just to give a few, our topics range from politics and education to social media and identity. So please join the discussion by tuning in to Sisters Speak. Tune in on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. on Inspire 105.1 FM. And also find us on Instagram at Sisters Speak.
From the studios of Inspire FM, the time is now 10:30.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Book Club show on Inspire 105.1 FM. My name is Imrana Mahmood. It is the 9th of January. It's just turned 10:30. On today's show, we are discussing The 100 Years' War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. The subtitle is A History of Settler, Colonial Conquest and Resistance. On today's show, I am joined by Samia Aziz, who is a book blogger and is the founder of the Diverse Bookshelf podcast. Just before the break, we were talking a little bit about the history of Palestine, just to contextualize what is currently happening. The book title in itself obviously already implies that. So the first chapter kind of looks at 1917. It then goes on to look at obviously the Balfour Declaration and the impact that had. You then have this different declaration of war, which kind of, I guess, takes us on a journey from the First World War to the second, and then ultimately how is this situation between Israel and Palestine came into being. There's a little bit of conversation we had about kind of erasure, and actually because of the relentless bombardment at the moment of Gaza, and the fact that we literally have historical sites and mosques and art, and art and institutions being completely decimated. And obviously that's not even to mention the number of people that have been killed. I think the last number was just over 22,000, and we know so many of those people are actually women and children. So it's utterly devastating. There's things that we are seeing currently on social media, and I think it's very safe to say, personally, for myself, as somebody who kind of transitioned in a way from kind of the post 9/11 era, so being a teenager at that time and seeing how, I guess, the world literally felt like it changed overnight. This seems to almost mirror to some extent those kind of feelings, but the difference I definitely found this time is we are literally seeing live footage. These atrocities are being committed in front of our eyes, and it's something very, very I guess it is really heartbreaking. So it means it's really important that as different communities we are able to come together, whether regardless of our faith and culture and background, that we're able to show solidarity to one another. That could be going to the various protests that have been happening in London, in Luton, and across various cities, and not just in the UK but around the world. But other ways are just like we mentioned in the first half of the show, pick up a book by a Palestinian writer or a Palestinian author, and maybe look at some artwork. There's different things that are taking place. So there's so many outlets I think we have, and there's so many ways of kind of doing activism. I don't know, even if that's the right term to use, but for anybody who's listening in and maybe kind of struggling, definitely reach out to family, reach out to friends. And I think that's really important, that in this day and age, especially in the UK context, where as minoritized people, we've always, I guests struggled, in different ways. And although, we are very much proud to be Muslim, we can be unapologetic in terms of our faith, it always does help, I think, just having, people around you and being able to have those discussions. So just coming back to Samia Aziz, who is our guest, I guess before we delve straight into the book, what is helping you manage this current time? Because obviously you're working, you have obviously your podcast that you also kind of dedicated to at the moment. How are you managing your time, I guess, with everything?
How am I managing my time? I mean, that's quite a good question. I think just being more conscious, I think, of what I'm doing at the moment. I think the reality is that since October 7th, I haven't wanted to do as much like fun stuff or like chilled out stuff as before, because I haven't had the appetite for it. And I think naturally that has opened up more time for me to spend educating myself, informing myself on what is going on. I think like with the podcast, it made sense to me to, I mean, I've always, because on the show I interview authors from underrepresented communities, I have interviewed Palestinian authors on the show previously, but it made sense for me to try and make the podcast another resource for information in this time right now. And so like I made a pivot. So some of the time that I would have spent contacting publishers or authors with regards to other books, I have directed that energy towards the cause instead. I think the thing to remember is that like not one person can't do everything. And I think we have this sense of burden on ourselves all the time. There's like this horrific thing is happening in Palestine, and I'm sat here in my warm home, eating great food, wearing lovely clothes, and I'm not doing anything to stop it. I think having some perspective is really important, because otherwise what happens is we just end up with a complete block where we're not doing anything useful for even like the people in our own lives, especially not for the cause, and we're just sort of drowning in guilt. And I think in this particular time, that is the least helpful emotion right now. I think the thing to remember is that we can all do something, whether that is, in educating ourselves so that we can speak about it and help change the narrative, whether it is boycott, whether it is go to protests. I think just finding or like really believing that these things can make a difference and that this is what we can do, because the reality is and it has always been the case that war and international politics is determined by so few people. Yes. It's the leaders of America and the UK, Germany, France, and these major players. There are literally a handful of men, but there are things that we can do that can change things in a different way. And I think it's just important to keep that perspective.
Yeah, no, I think everything you said is, really, really, something I guess, it's food for thought, isn't it? And especially what you're saying about this feeling of guilt and burden, and the idea that, of course, we naturally, we're going to feel like that. And I know, to some extent, actually, that's the way I think to think about it is to feel those things is to be human, and it's to remind us of our humanity. And obviously, when I see people who are kind of sharing or not sharing or not actually understanding, I really do feel, I think, I don't know where the humanity has gone, and there's something so sad and devastating about that. But I think, again, you're right. I think it really is about thinking, what can we do in our own sphere, and that could be, for example, as a parent, you just maybe educating your child about something, that's been happening. That in itself is empowering kind of the next generation. Again, it could be, just buying a book about a Palestinian writer, or, for example, listening to, a podcast show and just being able to do that, I think is really, really important.
I was listening to something recently where, a lot of people, because it's so heavy, we have a tendency that we just want to switch off and we want to turn away. And I completely understand it, because it is difficult. It feels like everything we knew to be true about humanity and the world has just like disappeared overnight almost. Like it just feels like it's the most horrible situation to be witnessing and to find ourselves in, almost helpless. And I think that, yeah, sometimes we do need a little bit of time to ourselves. And I think that's important, because we have to show up in other ways. And unless we take care of ourselves, we can never contribute to the cause well enough. But I think some of the scholars say as well that the lowest thing that we can do, or like the thing of, you know, like that requires least, is to bear witness. And I think to bear witness, yeah, so that, you know, maybe inshallah in the hereafter, on the day of judgment, we can also say, I bore witness and I know this happened, so we can be part of justice. But also in terms of like history, if we allow ourselves to bear witness right now, we will help form the history that gets passed on going forward, because we can call things out for being not true, and we can be sources of knowledge and information for people collecting data and writing reports in like 30, 40, 50 years time. Someone can interview you, or someone can interview me, and because we bore witness, we have the knowledge. I think it's a really just an important thing also to remember.
No, definitely. I mean, this idea of bearing witness is so strong, and it kind of makes me think of this idea of, you know, what is we're seeing a lot, you know, in terms of like martyrdom and the martyrs in Palestine, and even the language around that. Because I remember seeing on, again, you know, one of the social media platforms, you know, this kind of disinformation on intentionally to make people scared of what the word kind of martyr means. But actually that in itself, you know, to be shaheed is to bear witness, right? And we know ultimately one of the feelings which I think is to some extent a consolation is to know there is there will be a day of judgment. They will to be able to, again, you know, be in solidarity in this life with one another, and be in support of one another. But, you know, hopefully with the desire to, like you said, you know, see justice. Now, in terms of language as well, for example, there's a quote in the book, The 100 Years War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. So in December 1987, an Israeli army vehicle struck and killed 4 Palestinians in the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza. Outrage about the collision sparked spontaneous demonstrations and protests that snowballed into an 8-year anti-colonial campaign called the First Intifada, or uprising. So in the UK, the term Intifada or many other Arabic terms are being treated as anti-Semitic. So what do you think is the best way to challenge that, I guess, disinformation? Or is there a way even?
Yeah, I think it feels really scary when you have somebody tell you that an Arabic word that means uprising, or even like in like Nakba means catastrophe, for example, to have these words being framed as anti-Semitic, which is actually a crime that is potentially punishable by law. Like, it feels very scary. And I think there's a couple of things we need to do. And I think the first is we need to understand exactly what the definition of anti-Semitism is, and to be able to, one, to challenge it, but two, to work within that. And I think what we've seen over the years, and this isn't just since October 7th, like we've seen it over the years, this growing change from anti-Semitism being more than just sort of hatred or bigotry towards the Jewish community or people of Jewish faith, and moving towards anybody that criticizes the state of Israel or Zionism. And it's very, very harmful and deeply problematic. And but I think it's important to know that is happening and to understand why. And it's happening because it supports the Zionist project, and it supports the UK's stance, which is to be an ally to Israel. But also, I think the other thing to do is to make sure that we're using words in the right way, because when we're not Arabic speakers, it's very easy for us to use the word in a way that could be potentially harmful, or in a way that is open to interpretation that can lead to quite negative consequences. And so I think I think it's twofold. I think the first is to make sure that we know what words mean and really understand why they've been used at certain points. And then the other thing is to understand exactly what is meant in, like, at least the UK context of anti-Semitism. And then I think, we should be trying to reclaim the use of our language and our words. And to be able to use it in ways so that it doesn't feel so alien. So we should be speaking more freely about it. We should be talking about what happened and being able to use those words, and to understand that actually, like, words, some of them, especially if they are labeled from the community themselves, that there is great power within that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, in terms of language, everything is powerful. There is the power to, empower and disempower. And I guess just taking that kind of conversation a little bit further, there's another kind of, it's not an exact quote, but it says quite early on, I think, in the book, the motivations were there was a desire to return the Hebrews to raw land of the Bible, and an anti-Semitic wish to reduce Jewish immigration to Britain. So, I think we sometimes maybe forget the fact that actually there was even a reason to why the Jewish people migrated to that land. Why do you think there is a bit of ignorance about the fact that this is kind of the fact that Israel was partly born out of Europe's rampant anti-Semitism, which is a quote from the book itself?
I think because Britain is doing what it does best, which is never accepting responsibility for the things that it's done. I think we think of anti-Semitism and we think of the 1940s and the Holocaust, but the reality is that Jewish populations have been persecuted historically from like the early 20th century. I mean, they're not the only community to have been persecuted, right? But there definitely has been. I think would be a bit silly not to understand that was the case. And Britain, being Britain, didn't want to be overly sympathetic in that they didn't want to open their borders. They didn't want the Jewish community to come into Britain. There was a deep-rooted anti-Semitism, which is what made them say, okay, well, we're going to find a third solution, which ended up being Palestine. And the Zionist kind of the famous line that they use is that Palestine was a land without people, and that the Jewish people were a people without a land. And so it kind of makes sense that the two combined, and neither of those are actually, I mean, Palestine was not a land without people. And so I think it's important actually to look back at that and to understand that had Britain and other countries in Europe at the time been a little bit more benevolent and said, okay, we understand that you are a persecuted community and we're willing for you to come and live here, maybe there would never have been the need to support the Zionist cause, which is to have a Jewish-only homeland, because the two things are different. For a community to seek refuge somewhere is different for a community to say we need our own homeland. I think the two things are very different. And Britain seemed to say, because they didn't want to offer sanctuary and support, they ended up supporting the Zionist agenda, which is, as we know, has been absolutely catastrophic. But it goes way back. And I think the important thing also, Rashid Khalidi writes about it in his book, is that the Zionist agenda, the call for a Jewish-only state, did not begin just as the Second World War ended. It's something that predated that into the 1800s at the beginning of Zionist thought. So it's been something that was always there, but unfortunately it feels like Europe didn't act in the best way. And we've seen Britain do the same thing. They've been doing the same thing historically. They're doing it very recently by wanting to send asylum seekers and refugees to Rwanda. It's the same problem, right? It's the same issue. But now I guess it feels even more racist than it did back then.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think it's, it's one of those things that is, I know we discussed it, or we kind of mentioned it right at the start of the show, the idea that obviously even within the British context, we aren't taught about these things in school, and actually how important it is then we are all on an individual level, I guess, really making the effort to just to get more information. And and just to mention, I know this is the book club show, but if you're not maybe into books, there's plenty of really interesting films and documentaries that people are able to watch. There's a one which is I think much older. It's called Five Broken Cameras. There's something more recent that you can watch on one of the online streaming channels, which is I think it's Farha, if I'm correct. So all of these are very powerful. Obviously, very very difficult to watch, but again, it's that idea of not kind of turning away and just being really present in terms of the moment and what's currently taking place. But obviously, just on that note, also to say that we do need to be very mindful actually of the images that we are seeing, because obviously we are not, as human beings, designed to be, I guess, to some extent, exposed to so much. I guess I don't even know. I guess trauma might be the right word. So, lots of teachers and scholars also say, just to be very mindful. And, we do believe in the power of protest, but we obviously also believe in the power of the art. And both those things, hand in hand, I think can, make a massive, massive difference. So I guess one of the other things that I wanted to talk about in terms of what Rashid Khalidi mentions in his book is there's another quote that says the British treated the Palestinians with the same contemptuous condescension they lavished on other subjected peoples from Hong Kong to Jamaica. So I guess, it's kind of a double question. Why do you think maybe some of these, kind of diasporas are not or struggling to show solidarity? And also, how can we kind of overcome that as a kind of a community, I guess, in the UK context, to be able to come together as well?
This is a question that has plagued my mind over the last few months, especially. I think because part of it is that Israel is not looked at as a colonizer, number one. Okay. And then I think the other side of it is that because magically the role of Britain just seems to not be a thing, right? In like modern discourse, common discourse. And so I think if you don't look at Israel as a colonizer, what you look at them as is you look at them as a Jewish community that need or that are championing for their own homeland and that feel under attack, right? Like that's the very basic kind of argument that they have for themselves. But actually they are a colonizer, and colonizers are, by the very definition of them, violent. Their aim is to take over, like that's what they do. They expand and they take over, and part of that is ethnic cleansing and genocide, especially in the sort of Zionist project that we're seeing. I think we don't look at the same framework for Israel, or we haven't looked at it for a couple of reasons. And I think one of them is because Israel was not. So usually with the colonizer, you have like a mother country or like a starting country. So like Britain, when they're colonizer, it was Great Britain, and they went and they took over these other countries. Israel was not a country before. There was not a state that began this colonial project. They were just a group of people, I guess, scattered all around Europe or all around the world. And so I think that changes the way that you look at it, because you don't see them as being a colonizer in the same way. But actually, if we understand what colonialism is, this is exactly a colonial project. And I think unless we bring that shift about ourselves in understanding, it's difficult to be able, I think, to really understand the ways in which we should be challenging it. So I think that is definitely one. And I think the other is as we've been talking about, is like this lack of understanding that actually, Britain, when it was an empire, when it was actually the most powerful country in the world, was where it all started, unfortunately. But I also, I say that, and then I don't know if that is enough. Like, I don't know if that is enough of an excuse almost, right? For people to be witnessing what is happening and still not feel like they should come out and not see the similarities with what has happened. Because, you know, like, especially like if we look at the partition of India, we know how bloody and violent that was. And yeah, there was violence and brutality at the hands of the British, but we know that now. Maybe we didn't know it 30 years ago, but that information is a lot more easily accessible now. And so I don't know really how you can be from communities that have been so persecuted and witnessed so much and not see that similarity and not find that sort of companionship and allyship at the moment. I find it really confusing.
Yeah, and I guess there is that kind of sense of confusion, you know, just to echo what you're saying. And I think, again, I guess what it comes back down to is if we are in a position that maybe we feel like we don't have enough knowledge, or we kind of use it describing the situation as being complicated and not understanding it. Ultimately, though, it comes back to what we were saying earlier about, you know, where is our humanity? We are literally seeing images coming out of Palestine, coming out of Gaza, which are really heartbreaking and soul destroying. We are seeing families, whole generations being wiped out. And I think that's really where people need to maybe just kind of stop and pause and really think, actually, what can I be doing in this moment? What difference can I be making right now? And I think, you know, inshallah, that is something that, you know, if we're all able to really kind of hold on to and have that intention, especially now, you know, we're at the start of a new year and there is a lot taking place, and just, yeah, I guess just to have that belief in each other and just to be able to be in solidarity and always have hope, you know, inshallah, as well.
Do you think that maybe
but we are sorry but yeah, no, we will be back, you know, and I'll have Samia on the show again very soon. We were just talking about the 100 Years War in Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. Please keep